California's largest reservoir has been behaving in ways that even long-time water managers quietly acknowledge they have never documented at this scale or speed. Over a span measured in days rather than months, Shasta Lake climbed an astonishing 56.6 feet, equivalent to approximately 17.3 meters, a vertical rise that would normally take an entire wet season under ideal conditions. Instead, the increase unfolded in record time, following a relentless series of atmospheric rivers that swept across Northern California with unusual persistence. The speed alone invites scrutiny. The volume implied by such a rise raises even more questions. How does a reservoir of this size absorb that much water so quickly without triggering downstream emergencies? Where exactly did all that water come from, and why did it arrive with such precision? Shasta Lake is not a small or obscure body of water tucked away in a remote basin. At full pool, it stretches more than 35 miles, or roughly 56 kilometers, along its winding arms and stores up to 4,552,000 acre-feet of water, which translates to about 5.6 billion cubic meters. The reservoir is held back by Shasta Dam, a concrete gravity structure rising more than 600 feet, or approximately 183 meters, above the Sacramento River. Every fluctuation in lake level reflects a complex balancing act between inflows from snowmelt and rainfall, controlled releases for flood management, hydroelectric generation, agricultural demand, and ecological requirements downstream. A rise of this magnitude compresses years of hydrologic expectation into a single season. The recent surge followed a parade of atmospheric rivers that repeatedly targeted the same corridors across the Pacific. These were not isolated storms separated by long dry intervals. Instead, the precipitation arrived in successive pulses, each saturating the landscape further before the next arrived. Watersheds feeding the Sacramento, McCloud, and Pitt rivers reached saturation early, meaning subsequent rainfall translated directly into runoff rather than soaking into soil. Snow levels fluctuated as warmer systems pushed freezing lines higher into the mountains, turning what might have been snow accumulation into immediate liquid input. This convergence of factors funneled extraordinary volumes of water into Shasta Lake in a compressed time frame. Satellite measurements and reservoir gauges documented the rise with precision. Day after day, the lake climbed several feet, sometimes exceeding 3 feet or nearly 1 meter, in a single 24-hour period. Such daily increases are rare for a reservoir of this scale, especially outside of historic flood years. Yet this was not a case of uncontrolled flooding. Releases from the dam were carefully calibrated, increasing gradually to maintain downstream safety while still allowing the reservoir to capture as much water as possible. The result was a delicate choreography between restraint and necessity, all playing out under the watch of automated systems and decades-old operating rules. To grasp the scale of what occurred, it helps to translate the vertical rise into volume. A 56.6-foot increase across Shasta Lake represents well over 1 million acre-feet of additional storage, equivalent to roughly 1.2 billion cubic meters of water. That is enough to supply millions of households for an entire year or irrigate vast stretches of agricultural land through multiple growing seasons. Accumulating that amount in such a short period challenges conventional planning models, which are built on assumptions derived from historical averages rather than clustered seams. The timing added another layer of complexity. California entered the season still bearing institutional memory of prolonged drought. Reservoir operations had been cautious, with lower starting levels designed to preserve flood control capacity. That decision inadvertently created the space necessary for this dramatic rise. Had the lake begun the season closer to capacity, operators would have been forced to release much larger volumes downstream, potentially compounding flood risk. Instead, the reservoir functioned exactly as designed, absorbing the surge like a pressure valve. Yet, even as the system appeared to perform flawlessly, subtle anomalies drew attention within monitoring data. Inflows during certain storm intervals exceeded projections based on precipitation totals alone. In other words, the amount of water entering the lake was, at times, higher than expected, even after accounting for saturated soils and snowmelt contributions. This discrepancy was not large enough to trigger alarms, but it was consistent enough to merit internal review. Hydrologic models depend on known variables: rainfall intensity, watershed area, soil moisture, snowpack depth, and temperature. When observed inflows repeatedly sit above modelled ranges, analysts take notice. One explanation lies in terrain response. Prolonged drought conditions preceding the wet season may have altered soil structure in ways that reduced infiltration capacity beyond what standard saturation models predict. Compacted, desiccated soils can behave almost like pavement when intense rain arrives, shedding water rapidly into channels. Burn scars from previous wildfire seasons further exacerbate this effect, stripping vegetation and organic layers that normally slow runoff. The Upper Sacramento watershed contains multiple such areas, each contributing incrementally to faster and more efficient delivery of water into the reservoir. Another factor involves snowpack dynamics. Several atmospheric rivers arrived with warmer air masses that elevated snow levels well above average. Snow that might otherwise have accumulated at higher elevations instead fell as rain or rapidly melted existing snow. This phenomenon, sometimes described as rain-on-snow events, can dramatically amplify runoff by releasing stored water all at once. When these events occur repeatedly over a short span, they can transform mountain watersheds into powerful conduits. Still, these explanations do not fully account for the consistency of the excess inflows observed during certain periods. The data does not suggest error, nor does it indicate any structural anomaly at the dam or measuring stations. Instead, it hints at a more systemic shift in how large watersheds respond under sequences of extreme weather. The rise of 56.6 feet, or 17.3 meters, may therefore represent more than an isolated hydrologic success. It may be an early signal that baseline assumptions are quietly becoming outdated. Downstream, the Sacramento River absorbed increased releases without catastrophic flooding, aided by careful timing and the buffering effect of upstream reservoirs. Levees held, bypasses functioned as intended, and communities remained largely unaffected. This outcome reinforces the effectiveness of coordinated water management. Yet it also underscores the narrow margins involved. A similar sequence occurring with reservoirs already near capacity would present a very different risk profile. As Shasta Lake continued to climb, public attention focused largely on the visible transformation. Boat ramps re-emerged from dry ground, marinas adjusted docks upward, and familiar bathtub rings faded beneath rising water. To many observers, the scene symbolized relief after years of scarcity. To water managers, it represented both opportunity and caution. Abundance arriving too quickly carries its own challenges, from managing debris flows to maintaining dam safety margins under sustained pressure. Near the latter stages of the rise, analysts began comparing the event to historical records. Only a handful of seasons showed comparable total gains, and none matched the speed observed this time. Even the legendary wet years of the past unfolded over longer intervals. The compressed nature of the increase stands out as its defining characteristic. It raises a quiet but consequential question. Is this an outlier or a preview? What makes this moment particularly significant is not simply that Shasta Lake rose dramatically, but that it did so within the operational envelope without overt failure or crisis. Systems held. Models guided decisions. Yet within the data, small deviations persist, subtle enough to be overlooked but consistent enough to matter. These deviations are not errors, and they are not accidents. They suggest that something within the broader hydrologic equation is changing in ways that are not yet fully captured by existing frameworks. As the reservoir stabilized and attention shifted towards spring operations, internal reviews continued. Not to assign blame or credit, but to understand why a lake of this size could rise so fast, so smoothly, and yet slightly outside expectations. The answer does not lie in a single storm, nor in any mechanical feature of the dam itself. It lies elsewhere, upstream and systemic, embedded in patterns that are only now becoming visible. As the immediate pressure of storm inflows eased, attention shifted from day-by-day lake-level changes to the broader implications of what had just occurred. Shasta Lake did not merely rise quickly, it did so in a way that compressed hydrologic processes that usually unfold gradually. Snowmelt, rainfall runoff, and reservoir capture overlapped almost perfectly, producing an efficiency that rarely appears in real-world conditions. This efficiency is where the significance of the event becomes clearer. Reservoirs are designed around probabilities. Storage curves, flood control rules, and release schedules assume a certain pacing of water delivery from the landscape. Even in wet years, water typically arrives in waves spaced far enough apart to allow soils to reset, snowpack to stabilize, and rivers to moderate. What happened at Shasta Lake disrupted that rhythm. The watershed did not pause between storms. It behaved as a continuously primed system, transferring water downslope with minimal delay. The Sacramento River system upstream of Shasta covers thousands of square miles or tens of thousands of square kilometers and includes terrain ranging from low-elevation valleys to high mountain basins. Under normal circumstances, that diversity spreads runoff over time. Lower elevations respond first, higher elevations later as snow melts. During the recent sequence, that staggered response collapsed. Rain fell across elevations that normally remain frozen. Snow that did accumulate was repeatedly melted by warmer air masses. As a result, multiple elevation zones contributed simultaneously. This synchronization is the key detail that distinguishes the event from historical wet periods. The lake did not simply receive more water than usual. It received water from everywhere at once. That simultaneity explains how a vertical rise of 56.6 feet, or approximately 17.3 meters, could occur without the prolonged build-up seen in past records. It also explains why inflow measurements sometimes exceeded modelled expectations, even when precipitation totals appeared unremarkable on their own. As data analysts reviewed inflow curves against precipitation maps, another pattern emerged. The most pronounced discrepancies appeared after the third and fourth atmospheric river events, not the first. By that point, the watershed had already been heavily flushed. Channels were clear of debris that can temporarily slow flow. Soils had lost much of their remaining absorptive capacity. Vegetation, dormant from winter conditions, contributed little resistance. Each additional storm therefore produced a higher percentage of direct runoff than the one before it. This cascading efficiency created a compounding effect. Even moderate rainfall late in the sequence behaved like heavy rainfall would under normal conditions. The watershed effectively shifted states, operating under a different set of rules than those embedded in long-standing hydrologic assumptions. Shasta Lake became the measuring instrument for that shift, its rising surface translating invisible processes into visible change. For water planners, the implications extend beyond a single reservoir. Shasta Lake anchors the Central Valley Project, a system that supplies water to cities, farms, and ecosystems across much of California. The timing and magnitude of storage gains influence decisions months and even years ahead. A rapid rise early in the season can alter release strategies, power generation schedules, and allocation forecasts. While abundance reduces immediate scarcity concerns, it also compresses decision-making windows. There is also the matter of structural stress, not in the sense of imminent danger, but in cumulative load. A reservoir rising more than 17 meters in a short span increases pressure on dam structures, abutments, and foundation interfaces. Shasta Dam is engineered to withstand far greater forces, yet engineers still track the rate of change as closely as the absolute level. Rapid loading and unloading cycles introduce different considerations than slow seasonal variation. In this case, the system remained well within safety margins, but the rate itself becomes part of the dataset for future evaluations. Downstream ecosystems experienced their own version of the shift. Controlled releases increased river flows without breaching thresholds that trigger emergency flooding. Fish migration queues aligned with higher water levels earlier than usual. Floodplains designed to activate under specific conditions did so briefly, then receded. These responses were orderly, yet they occurred on an accelerated schedule that compressed ecological signals into a narrower time frame. As spring approached, snow surveys showed a paradox. Despite the massive inflows already captured, significant snowpack still remained at higher elevations. This meant that the reservoir's dramatic rise did not exhaust future supply potential. Instead, it created a layered situation in which immediate abundance overlapped with deferred input. Managing that overlap requires careful calibration, especially if additional storms arrive while snowmelt accelerates. The deeper question, however, is why this alignment occurred now. Atmospheric rivers are not new to California, nor are rapid reservoir rises unheard of. What distinguishes this episode is the consistency and sequencing of conditions that allowed maximum conversion of precipitation into stored water. The storms followed similar tracks, temperatures hovered in a narrow range that favoured runoff over storage in snow, and antecedent conditions primed the landscape for efficiency. Near the end of internal assessments, one conclusion began to surface quietly within the data, not as a declaration, but as an inference. The rise of Shasta Lake was not the result of an extreme outlier storm or a singular meteorological anomaly. It was the result of average to above average events aligning under altered baseline conditions. In other words, what appeared extraordinary in outcome was built from components that individually no longer qualify as rare. This is the reveal embedded within the numbers. The mystery is not where the water came from in a geographic sense, but how the system converted it so completely and so quickly. The answer lies in the cumulative effect of long-term drying, land surface changes, and warming-influenced storm behavior. Together, these factors have subtly redefined how watersheds respond, allowing reservoirs like Shasta to fill with unprecedented speed without a single dramatic trigger. This realization carries implications that extend beyond celebration or concern. It suggests that future wet seasons may increasingly arrive in concentrated bursts rather than evenly distributed patterns. Reservoirs may oscillate more sharply between low and high levels. Flood control rules based on slower historical responses may require re-evaluation, not because they failed, but because they may be asked to perform under compressed timelines more often. For now, Shasta Lake stands as a visible marker of this transition. Its surface reflects both relief and responsibility. The water it holds will sustain communities, agriculture, and ecosystems through dry months ahead. At the same time, the manner in which it arrived serves as a data point that cannot be ignored. California's largest reservoir rose 56.6 feet, or 17.3 meters, in record time, not because the system broke, but because it worked under new conditions that are quietly becoming familiar. Understanding that distinction may prove more important than the rise itself, as planners look ahead to seasons where speed, not just volume, defines the challenge. If you found this analysis informative and want to see more deep dives into the forces shaping our environment, please like this video, share it with others, subscribe to the channel, and tap that hype icon to help it reach a wider audience. Your support helps bring these stories into clearer focus.